Hello, and thank you for coming to my YouTube channel. Please hit that like and subscribe button if you have not already. Well, today is June the 19th, 2020. Juneteenth. And I was asked what would be my offering for today. And it came to me that I should present the Frederick Douglass timeline. And you'll find that in the book, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. The Frederick Douglass timeline. 1619 on August 20th. The first group of some 20 captive Africans arrive at Jamestown, Virginia. This marks the beginning of slavery in what would become the United States of America. 1776 on July the 4th, the Second Continental Congress adopts the Declaration of Independence, which states that all men are created equal. 1788, June 21st, the U.S. Constitution is ratified after being signed by the 9th New Hampshire of 13 states. This document includes 3/5 clause that, for the purpose of the representation and taxation, which counts enslaved people as 3/5 of a person. 1808, Congress bans the importation of enslaved people from any country. 1818, Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, who would later become Frederick Douglass, is born on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay in Talbot County, Maryland. 1827, Sophia Auld, the wife of Frederick's master, begins teaching young Frederick his letters. And when Mr. Auld discovers what she's doing, he forbids her to continue teaching Frederick, or it would forever unfit him to be a slave. From that point forward, Douglass understands that reading or knowledge is his pathway from slavery to freedom. 1831, Douglass got hold of, bought for 50 cents, a copy of the Columbian Orator. It made a bold denunciation of slavery and a powerful vindication of human rights. He said, "The more I read, the more I was led to abhor and detest my enslavers." 1834, January 1st, Douglass is sent to live with Edward Covey, Mr. Edward Covey, who had acquired a very high reputation for breaking young slaves. In August, Douglass resolved to fight Covey, a decision Douglass identifies as the turning point in my career as a slave. Douglass's service with Covey ends December 25th. April 1836. Douglass plans to escape with 4 other enslaved men. but they are betrayed prior to implementing the plan. Douglas and the others are taken to Eastern Jail in Talbot County, Maryland. 1838, September the 3rd. Douglas disguises himself as a sailor and escaped to New York City. On September 15th, he marries Anna Mary. Then they proceed to settle in New Bedford, Massachusetts. He changes his name to Frederick Douglass. 1839, daughter Rosetta is born. Douglass subscribes to the Liberator newspaper, edited by William Lloyd Garrison, saying it set his soul all on fire. He attends anti-slavery meetings. In 1840, his son Lewis is born. His daughter Rosetta, she died in 1906. 1840, his son Lewis is born. 1841, August 9th, Douglass sees William Lloyd Garrison speak at the Bristol Anti-Slavery Society's annual meeting. Douglass is invited to speak 2 days later at an anti-slavery convention in Nantucket. 1842, he had a son, Frederick Jr. was born. He was born in 1842 and he died in 1892. 1844, another son, Charles Raymond, is born in 1844 and he died in 1920. 1845, May 28th, Douglass publishes his first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. He travels to England, Ireland, and Scotland when the narrative gains popularity and places his freedom in danger. Douglass meets Ireland's Daniel O'Connor, the Liberator. In 1846, friends from Newcastle upon Tyne of the United Kingdom raise enough money, $711, to buy Douglass's freedom from his former master, Hugh Auld, in Maryland. That was December the 12th. Douglass becomes a free man. 1847, December 3rd, Douglass establishes the North Star abolitionist newspaper in Rochester, New York. He meets the influential abolitionist, John Brown. In 1848, July 19th, Douglass participates in the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. In 1849, his daughter Annie is born. She died in 1860. In 1850, September 18th, the Fugitive Slave Act is passed, requiring that freedom-seeking people who escaped slavery must be returned to their owner upon capture. In 1852, July the 5th, Douglass delivers his famous speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July," in Rochester. In 1855, Douglass publishes his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom. 1859, October 16th, John Brown is captured at Harper's Ferry. Douglass flees to Canada, then to Europe to evade arrest on charges of being Brown's accomplice. Just a footnote here, you know, John Brown stayed in the house of Frederick Douglass. And I think he might have shared with Frederick Douglass what he was going to do, and Frederick Douglass said, "Man, are you crazy?" But that's just a footnote. To continue on. In 1860, his daughter was born, and she died young at the age of 10. We don't know what from. In 1861, April the 12th, the Civil War begins when Confederate shore battles fire upon Fort Sumter in South Carolina. That was 1861, April the 12th, the Civil War began in Sumter, South Carolina. In 1863, January 1, President Abraham Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation 100 days after issuing its preliminary draft. August the 10th, Douglas visits Lincoln at the Executive Mansion in Washington, D.C. Douglas lobbies Lincoln to allow black soldiers to fight in the Union Army. His first recruits into the Massachusetts 54th are his sons Lewis and Charles. Lewis fights in the Battle of Fort Wagner on Morris Island in Charleston Harbor. The battle is popularized in the 1989 film Glory. In 1864, August 25th, Douglas meets President Lincoln at the Executive Mansion, later to become known as the White House, to discuss Lincoln's re-election campaign. In 1865, March 4th, Douglas attends Lincoln's inauguration and is greeted personally by the president at the inauguration ball. The Civil War comes to an end. The 13th Amendment, the first of the Reconstruction Amendments, which also include the 14th and 15th Amendments, is ratified formally, ending the nation's legal institution of slavery for all except those convicted of a crime. The amendment's exception clause opens the possibility of abuse, exploitation, and inequity within the criminal justice system. Black code laws began to be enacted in former Confederate states to restrict the rights of newly freed black citizens. In 1866, note the date, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 gives the full benefit of the laws and equal rights as citizens to African Americans. The act was passed by a 2/3 vote of Congress, overriding the veto of President Andrew Johnson, who argued that blacks were not qualified for citizenship. May I read that again? In 1866, the Civil Rights Act gives the full benefit of the laws and equal protections to African Americans. This act was passed by a 2/3 vote of Congress, overriding the veto of President Andrew Johnson, who argued that blacks were not qualified for citizenship. Now in 1868, 2 years later, the 14th Amendment is ratified, defining what it is to be a U.S. citizen. It prohibits states from restricting citizens' rights and ensures each citizen the right to due process and equal protection of the law. In 1870, February the 3rd, the 15th Amendment is ratified, giving all men the right to vote, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But women continued to be excluded. Women were excluded from the right to vote. In 1871, January, Douglas is appointed by President Ulysses Grant to the Commission of Inquiry for the possible annexation of Santo Domingo. In 1874, Frederick Douglass is named president of the struggling Freedmen's Savings and Trust. Hoping to help resuscitate the bank, Douglass donates his own money, but the institution could not be saved. 1875. Again, note the year, 1875. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 is passed to guarantee all Americans, regardless of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude, equal treatment in public accommodations, public transportation, and to prohibit exclusion from jury service. That act was deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1883. In 1881, Frederick Douglass publishes his third autobiography, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. He is appointed Recorder of Deeds for the District of Columbia by President James Garfield. In 1882, Douglass's wife Anna dies. 2 years later, Douglass marries the well-known abolitionist Helen Pitts. She later creates the Frederick Douglass Memorial and Historical Association to preserve Douglass's Cedar Hill home in Anacostia, District of Columbia. The marriage is controversial because Helen is white. 1889, President Benjamin Harris appoints Douglass as minister to Haiti. He is also appointed charge d'affaires for Santo Domingo. In 1895, Douglass dies of a heart attack or stroke at Cedar Hill after returning from a meeting of the National Council of Women. In 1901, the Executive Mansion, the residence of the President of the United States, officially becomes the White House, Washington, shortly after Teddy Roosevelt hosts African-American educator Booker T. Washington for dinner, and the ensuing uproar amongst Southern legislators. That's all I am going to read today, and I hope that you found that very interesting as I did. Frederick Douglass was an exceptional man. I recorded that speech, and you can find that also on YouTube. Please listen to it and share that with your family and friends. You know, it took me 2 years to work on that project. And when I finally did get it, I felt the spirit of Frederick Douglass. So please listen to that and close your eyes and imagine that you're there listening to him speak. Thank you very much for coming to my channel. Please tune in again. That's all I can say. Thank you, and stay safe.